All right, your stream is up and running.
Okay.
Well, that could be.
I worked all day yesterday, and I don't think I started at the end of the days I feel today. So I
Who's
guess
got
that
seats
puts-
where?
Wherever you want to sit.
Ron and Tila sit here still?
Oh, Ron
Yeah, they
usually
sit
sits
there.
over there. Tina doesn't come to a Wednesday night class.
Oh,
I think she's teaching. Isaac sits there, so you're good.
who?
Isaac,
That's where he always sits.
yeah. And Ron sits over there. Donna's not gonna be here tonight. She's having dental work.
Is your wife here?
Everybody else sits back there.
On the back.
Yeah.
Is your wife with you?
She wants to stay in Acts.
She wants to stay in Acts.
I mean Ephesians.
Ephesians.
Oh, Visions.
Yeah. But they weren't going deep enough in Ephesians for me. So
Well,
I just,
I hope we'll go deep enough here for you, but
well, I got some help.
you got some notes, huh?
Well, I went up
Hi,
on
Sister Decker.
internet and
Hello,
looked
Karen.
Doing pretty good.
up some commentaries on Leviticus.
Hello,
I don't
Brother
have
Decker.
one.
Oh,
Pretty.
do you have a laptop computer?
Top
Yeah.
you have on.
No, I got
Thank you.
a Mac.
Pretty. That's your hair.
Apple?
I should get her too.
I don't know if that program will work on the Apple computer. Let me go get it and see if.
Hello, young lady.
Hi, Brother
How are
Carter.
you doing?
Good, how are
Good.
you?
I'm fit as a fiddle.
Fit as a fiddle, huh?
Fit as a fiddle.
Okay. For you.
And there's Pat.
So you still going to therapy, Sister Decker? No?
Yeah.
You
How
done?
you doing?
I'm doing okay. How are you?
I'm doing
Yeah,
great.
Medicare said
All
no
right.
more.
I'm doing
No
great.
more.
I don't think it was helping me.
Uh-huh.
I was hungry.
Oh, okay.
It's supposed to be cold tonight. It's not cold at all.
I tell him, just do it. It's not really. You know what's helped me the most of all?
What?
2 days after,
Hi, Sister Pat.
2 days after going there,
Uh-huh.
I had a appointment with my heart doctor. Well, I knew my blood pressure was here. She put new on me last time I'd seen her.
Uh-huh.
And my knees, I guess it keeps going up so big.
Uh-huh.
So,
See your laces?
No,
Oh.
no, she changed my blood pressure.
Oh,
I went to see her. When I went to see her, she changed.
Well,
my
somebody's
blood
got my copy here, Chuck, but I'm pretty sure I got one at home.
Things started feeling
But it's
good.
a-
But my legs.
It's a Bible program that has,
They hurt worse.
well, it's probably got about 10 different commentaries on it.
So my hubby.
And just really nice, and that's what I use.
Blood cells.
Because and it's got several versions of the Bible
Yeah.
there as well.
He said, go
Uh,
off of your license. I mean, your.
Not logos,
statin,
is it?
No,
Which was for
but I can,
cholesterol. I said, go off of that for about
I can go to
7
the different
days.
versions. The only one it doesn't have is the NIV, which suits me just fine, because I don't use the NIV.
I got a test. Have you ever seen that test on the NIV?
Dimples in my
No, but I've
Now,
got,
before, my legs was like,
so that
what's his name?
cholesterol medicine was
Foy Wallace wrote a book
interactive
on-
or not?
on the different
it
versions,
was
Yeah.
coming from the
about that thick.
Robert Taylor did too.
Yeah, and Foy doesn't have any kind of things to say about the NIV.
She had told me, she
No.
said, "Doctor, she
Uh,
changed your blood pressure medicine."
Have
She
you
said, "I'm
have you ever read the introduction on it?
Oh, yeah.
3 weeks. And,
It's a thought-provoking translation, not a word-for-word
Oh, yeah.
translation.
But everybody gets excited
Well,
about
it
it because
was.
it
So
has
then once I
one
got over this,
of the
I was gonna wait
420
a little longer,
people that wrote it,
see
only
what's
one
going
was
on,
Church
and
of
that's what I
Christ.
called.
And so everybody gets excited about it, but
Yeah.
most of it's Pentecostal.
She can't talk to the doctor, you gotta talk to the
Yeah.
people. that-
Well, there's so many passages that are omitted in it.
Cheryl, 4
Yeah,
weeks ago.
that's
She
true.
told me, she changed my blood
In fact,
pressure.
I saw that on
She said,
Facebook the other day.
"My blood pressure."
All the passages on
And
it.
everything's going. And I said, "What'd you say?"
Yeah, I got a copy of it. I picked it up off of concernedchristians.com.
And so I said, I
Yeah.
went for my, the statin, the statin. And
John
I said,
sits
"You know,
behind you there, and he
for 4 days."
flipped
I said,
back and forth
I cannot believe
on the slides.
I
Okay.
cannot believe how much difference. See, you have on the hip, what they were working
I know my sister Frida, she said she can't take the cholesterol medicine.
Oh, I get to hit you.
They
See
tried
if
to
you're out of
give it
line
to
or
her.
start snoring.
on. Yeah, well, that's
What?
what we do.
So he's sitting over here so I can hit him.
Hello,
if he
Brother
starts
John.
What's the
snoring.
matter, Isaac? You don't want to sit over
I'm
here?
doing fine.
Right.
Get over here.
Wait.
I took-
I'm not
scared.
I took a shower this morning.
Hey, you know,
Yeah, but Charles kicks.
when I was young, I always went to the back. You know, as you know, I always sit on the front row.
You always sit right there. You know where I can reach you.
I'm not going near that.
Yeah, I may not be the best student, but I'm up front. You know,
Hello,
so
Candy.
I know.
I'm doing all right.
Watch it, you know how they got
Is
me
that your private telephone
Isaac.
number I can call you
Yeah, they got me
Saturday?
off the back road.
Huh.
They
I
put
said,
me in
is that
charge
your
of
private
this.
telephone number I can call you Saturday?
Yeah, no, just giving it to
Private
Florence to leave it
telephone
alone.
number? Wow.
I know what you're talking about. Don't,
Uh,
don't
that's-
share with him.
About 3 o'clock, I'll call you Saturday.
3 o'clock, huh? Okay.
In the morning?
No, in the
Now
afternoon.
that you
Oh,
told
in
her,
the
she
morning.
could ignore it.
No, the game starts at 11 o'clock. It'll go
I
to
don't even know where the
2:30.
phone is.
You gotta get up, you gotta get up and get
Oh,
around.
that's right. We got a rival back here.
No, I gotta call her and tell her, look,
He's gotta
when you
call
get
me
back,
and
I'll
tell me
give you a crying
congratulations.
tag.
I've called her early in the morning before.
Yeah, he has.
Hey, Daddy,
Who are you going for?
And
The players
Oh,
can't
you.
do that.
I know.
Oh, you.
Because they're crybabies.
Who
Goes
you
there
rooting
what?
for?
Crybabies.
because they don't have their own hand sign.
Right. He's
They
going
have
for
their own
Texas.
hand sign, they
She
can use
is.
it.
Oh,
They don't have
yeah.
one.
He's going for Texas.
No, not John, her, Kenny.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
Ken.
He's a Texas fan.
Texas doesn't down, the horns down.
Although, she did have one son, the youngest son went to OSU, so she has to root for OSU for
Matt and
her.
Ryan both.
But it couldn't get.
Matt's working on his master's at OSU
10
now.
points.
Who is?
Matt.
Because.
He is.
Doing it on the computer,
Yeah.
computer courses.
Oh, online though.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is he gonna have to come and do something
How you doing?
on campus?
Is it all three of the boys go to OSU?
Casey went to Texas.
Casey went to Texas.
Byron and Casey went to Texas, and Matt and Ryan went to OSU. So OSU is my team when they're not playing Texas.
Oh, there you go.
All right, the clock on the wall says it's time to begin. In your handout, we had 3 questions to finish on chapter 10 on page 26.
Page what?
Page 26 in your handout. The last three questions on chapter 10.
Oh, I got them filled out.
Good for you. So you can answer them for me.
I don't know if I can read my writing, but I got it, something
Oh,
written
okay.
there.
All right. Donna won't be here tonight. She's having some dental work done, so sound like it's pretty severe dentist work, I guess. Of course, in my opinion, any dental work is severe.
Candace.
The dentist I'm going to now, first time I went to him, I said I'd rather take a beating than go to a dentist. And he
Did
said,
he
"Let
offer
me
to
go
take
get
you
my
out the
stick."
parking lot?
You're hearing this.
Yeah, offer to take you out behind the
He
building?
No,
probably-
he said, "Let me go get my stick." But that's the only one I know that is sick, so. Hello, Karen. Your handout is page 26, Karen.
Sit there.
Let's go to our Heavenly Father in prayer. Our most loving Heavenly Father, we thank Thee so much for this day and for the many blessings You've given us, especially the spiritual blessings and the promise of everlasting life if we'll be faithful to Thee. We're so thankful for Your Son who willingly died upon that cruel cross that we might have everlasting life if we'll be faithful to Thee. We're thankful for each and every member of this congregation, for the encouragement that we bring to each other, for the freedom we have in being able to study Thy Word without fear of persecution. And we ask as we continue to look into the book of Leviticus that we might have a full understanding of how it is to be applied to our lives and how we can look at it and see the New Testament written in it. We ask, Father, that You be with our members who have physical ailments, that they might be restored to their health. And we ask that You would be with our government officials, that they would work together to solve the problems of this country. These things we ask in Jesus Christ's holy name. Amen. All right. Question number 1 says the resolution of Eleazar and Ithamar. What is different between the two brothers in the first half of the chapter and the two brothers in the second half? Remember, the first two brothers we're talking about is Nadab and Abihu. They offered strange incense, or incense that was not authorized by God, and strange fire. So what do we know about Eleazar and Ithamar?
Eleazar and Ithamar, even though they violated the sacrificial code, they was not put to death.
Well, that's question number 2, Karen.
Oh, my bad.
But you're right. Here's the interesting thing about Eleazar and Ithamar. If you look at verse 12 of chapter 10, it says, "And Moses spoke to Aaron and to Eleazar and Ithamar, his sons who were left, take the grain offering that remains of the offerings made by fire to the Lord, and eat it without leaven beside the altar, for it is most holy." And of course, you go on down through the rest of chapter 10 there, and you see the instructions that was given to Aaron and his two sons, Eleazar and Ithamar. But Eleazar and Ithamar obviously followed God's commandments, did not think that they were something special, and did not offer strange fire and incense. But as Karen mentioned, the one thing we do know about Eleazar and Ithamar is that they did not disobey God. Look at verse 19 and 20 specifically. It says, "And Aaron said to Moses, Look, this day they have offered their sin offering and their burnt offering before the Lord, and such things have befallen me. If I had eaten the sin offering today, would it have been accepted in the sight of the Lord?" So when Moses heard that, he was content. And that kind of answers these 3 questions, because first off, Eleazar and Ithamar, what were the sacrifices they were offering? What did the high priest have to do?
Blood offering.
Well,
They had to offer a blood offering. They had to offer an offering for their sins first, right?
Right.
Okay. And so Eleazar and Ithamar was doing that. And so, in question number 2, did they follow all of God's instructions?
No, they didn't, because they did not eat the sacrifice in the, they were supposed to eat it
In a holy place.
in outside, in the, hold up. Why have you not eaten the sin offering in the holy place, since it is most holy?
Okay.
So,
So-
no,
They
they
did
didn't
because
follow
they didn't.
all of God's instructions.
So why weren't they punished?
Because they wasn't ready to be eating sin offering.
That, well, when I
So
was
they
reading
did and they didn't
commentators,
both.
We really don't know. We really don't know why they were not put to death. And when I was reading another commentator, basically it was like God's mercy. And I don't know why they weren't put to death, because they did violate God's instructions. But at the same time, Aaron, they did offer the offering, and I wrote that Aaron, their father, interceded on their behalf. And I thought Aaron interceded on their behalf because, to me, the family was still suffering over the death
It's our
of
sons.
over the death of Nadab and Abihu. So I'm thinking maybe they weren't in their fully right minds, or they, I don't know. But I just see God's mercy.
Who was probably given the directions here in this sacrifice?
Moses,
Well, Moses spoke to Aaron,
Aaron.
Aaron,
but
was
the
given
sacrifice was
direction.
made, and who was given the direction to?
To
Aaron,
the
wasn't
sons, Aaron was.
Aaron was. Aaron was the father of who?
it? The kids.
All of them.
All 4 of them.
All
All 4 of them, but 2's dead.
Yeah.
The 2
So-
that did too.
So here's 2 following the directions of their father, right?
Right.
Do you think maybe that might be why they were not punished?
Well, I was going to say because of Aaron, but
Well, that's what I'm saying,
yeah,
because of Aaron.
yeah.
Any thoughts? Anybody want to add anything to that?
We're confused enough.
Well, so all of this, Moses seemed to be a little bit concerned about this, because you look at verse 19, it says, and Aaron said to Moses, look, first off, in verse 17, Moses says, why have you not eaten the sin offering in a holy place, since it is most holy, and God has given it to you to bear the guilt of the congregation, to make atonement for them before the Lord? See, its blood was not brought inside the holy place. Indeed, you should have eaten it in the holy place as I commanded. Okay, this is Moses. So Aaron gives an answer in verse 19. And he said, look, this day they have offered their sin offering and their burnt offering before the Lord. Who is there? Who is the they there here?
The boys.
No.
No?
Look, this day they have offered their sin offering and their burnt offering.
Eleazar and Ithamar.
Right.
That's what we're saying.
Okay? They're offering it.
That's the
It's
thing.
their sin offering and their burnt offering for the Lord, and such things have befallen me. If I had eaten the sin offering today, would it have been accepted in the sight of the Lord? And so when Moses heard that, he was content. Because after he heard that, he saw that indeed Eleazar and Ithamar was indeed following the directions here, because they were offering a sin offering for their sins before they could offer offerings for the congregation or the people. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Everybody satisfied with that answer?
We still don't know, but yeah, your answer sounds fine. We can move on.
It sounds good?
We don't-
Alright, so, John asked a question after class last week, and he thinks I forgot it, but I didn't forget it. So if you look at chapter 10 and verse 10.
I don't know.
Chapter 10 and verse 10. What it says specifically, it says that you may distinguish between holy and unholy, and between unclean and clean. And John says, why is the difference here? Why didn't it say holy and unholy and clean and unclean, instead of reversing the unclean and clean? Anybody have any thoughts?
I can't can't even understand the question.
Well, what John wanted to know was why the reversal of when it said holy and unholy, why didn't it say clean and unclean instead of unclean and clean?
The way they wrote
That's
it.
just how they wrote it.
Thanks, Stephanie.
There you go.
Well, I have an answer.
Okay.
It's scriptures like this that gives John the opportunity to ask dumb questions.
It was written just for John.
There's no dumb question.
That's true. There's only dumb responses. You're exactly right, and I've said that many times. Now, to answer to your question, John, I did check all the commentaries. There's not one comment about it, but I do have a suspicion. Remember what I've been emphasizing about the book of Leviticus. The theme is be holy as I am holy. Okay? And so what we're going to be getting into, beginning in chapter 11, is talking about a lot of unclean things. God does not, He wants to make sure that the children of Israel fully understand what is unclean and what is clean. And so here he puts the unholy and unclean together to emphasize that these are things you must avoid. You must stay away from these things. And then in chapter 11, he's going to get into more detail about that, and specifically what they must stay away from. That's the best answer I can give you. But to answer your question, none of the commentaries had any comment on it.
It wasn't far enough to see a difference.
Do what? Yes, Karen.
And this thought just came to me when we was talking to him about the holy and unholy. So the holy and unholy is dealing with the spiritual aspect of the people, and the unclean and clean is dealing with the physical.
True.
So could it be that Moses was preparing them, or the Lord was preparing the priests, far as getting in the mindset of not only the spiritual but the physical needs of the people, that they were getting ready to take responsibility, forward to make sure that the people understood, those sacrificial laws as far as the food, etc. Because then we're going to go into, labor and etc., etc. So the priest was responsible for, training people.
Well, and that's exactly right. The high priest was responsible for ensuring that the people fully avoided those things that was unclean. And you're right, a lot of those things was physical, but the physical unclean things also dealt with the spiritual, in the sense that it helped them to understand that God will not tolerate anything that is unclean. And so that's why when you begin in chapter 11 through chapter 15, you're dealing with a lot of physical things there to really show them what is unclean. And some of those things we'll be able to carry over into the New Testament to fully understand why God expects us to avoid these things. Because God will not tolerate sin in any shape, form, or fashion. So, and keep in mind, these Israelites, they're going to be wandering in the wilderness for 39 years. Remember now, we talked about Exodus only being just about a year long. And Leviticus here is dealing with 50 days. And the 50 days is dealing with all the things that the emphasis of being holy as I am holy, and emphasizing that to them. And then because they still sinned, because you had the 12 spies and 10 of them gave a bad report, they wandered in the wilderness for 39 years because they had not learned their lesson yet. They've come out of idolatry, spending all those years in Egypt. And here's another interesting fact that you need to remember is when they went into Egypt, how many people went into Egypt? Remember why they went into Egypt. They were starving. Okay?
Yeah.
How many went into Egypt?
70.
70 people.
Yeah.
When we get to Numbers, that very first numbering in the first chapter, there was over 600,000. So, and why is this so? What was the promise God made to Abraham?
Your seed, all nations will be blessed.
In thy seed,
All nations will
All
be
the nations
blessed.
shall be blessed.
all nations will be blessed. Your seed will be as the stars,
Scott, ahead.
innumerable.
Sand.
And so indeed that's happening. And here's the other interesting thing to remember is the 39 years that they were in the wilderness, in the book of Numbers, you had every man 20 years of age and older die because of that sin, right?
Yeah.
And yet, at the last numbering, there was still over 600,000 people. God intended for His people to serve Him, to be faithful to Him, and to avoid all things unclean. And so that's the lessons that we're learning here. Yes, John?
Don't it say every one over 30? Over 20, I mean?
Over 20.
Yes, what did I say?
You said every man.
Okay,
The women over 20 died too.
yes. Ah, excuse me, John. Thanks for correcting me. Okay, so here's just a summation of what I want you to see. What we looked at in Leviticus chapter 8, 9, and 10. In chapter 8, we had the instructions for the ordination of the priesthood. Chapter 9, we had description of the opening ministry of these priests. And here in chapter 10, we had the judgment and replacing of sinning priest. The sinning priest obviously was Nadab and Abihu. And they were replaced by their two brothers, if you will. Okay? Now, so what we're going to see now in chapter 11, we're going to see regulations for clean and unclean animals. First, in verses 1 through 8, we'll have the land animals. Verses 9 through 12, we'll have the water animals. Verses 13 through 23, we have the flying animals and the insects. Verses 24 through 40, we have the dead animals. And verses 41 through 47, we have animals that swarm. Did God leave anything out? Covered everything, didn't He? He wanted to make sure that in detail that these people knew exactly what was expected of them. And so for that reason, this is what we're looking at. All right, so we look at Leviticus 11, verses 1 through 15, verse 33. We're going to be talking about cleanliness, okay? And I put a summary in your handout on page 26 and 27. And then the first question is on page 28. So, the book of Leviticus is written then to communicate the holiness of God. And the purpose was not to scare people about His holiness, but to recognize that God desires to dwell with His people, but at the same time recognizing that we are unholy. And so there are things that we must do. The reason we cannot approach God is because we are completely unholy while the Lord is high, lifted up, and immense in His holiness. The first 8 chapters of Leviticus then taught the people that they needed sacrifices and priests in order for God to be in fellowship with them. These laws were the grace of God so that they could be in His presence. In Leviticus chapter 10, we read about two people, Nadab and Abihu, who did not honor the holiness of God. They did not offer the sacrifice according to the directions that God gave them. Therefore, God needed to uphold and defend His holiness. So fire came out from before the Lord and consumed these two priests. Nadab and Abihu. The holiness of God must be upheld then, and we must see ourselves as unholy people. This is the point then that we're going to see in Leviticus chapters 11 through 15, okay? These are the laws to dictate what is clean and unclean. The people need to know how to remain clean in the presence of God, and that's going to be the starting purpose of this. So Leviticus chapter 11 then begins with the food laws. God declared that eating certain animals made a person unclean. Many have tried to give rationale as to why some foods were clean and some foods were not clean. But you and I must simply accept the fact that there is not an answer as to why a pig was unclean. Okay?
Yeah, there is.
But on the other hand, the cow was clean.
Pig doesn't chew a cud, it's unclean.
Yes, but
That's
why?
what it says.
I understand, but we eat pigs today.
Yeah.
But they were not to eat pigs because they were unclean. And yes, you're right, they had a cloven hoof, but they did not chew a cud. A cow had a cloven hoof and they chewed a cud. And that was the requirement there, or the instructions of God to determine a clean animal. A rabbit chews a cud, but it doesn't have cloven hooves. A camel chews a cud, but it doesn't have cloven hooves. Okay, so God gave specific instructions. And he did not say why, though. He just said, this is the way it is, period. Okay, Pat?
Because that bothered me, I kept thinking about it. I think it's because a pig will eat anything. They'll eat something dead, and that was forbidden. One of these animals that will eat dead things,
Yes,
they're forbidden. A
Yes.
pig will eat anything. Dead.
That's true.
Dead or alive.
That's
Rotten or
true.
not rotten.
They are vegetarians and they are carnivores.
They're right, exactly. So that's all I could come up with, why these
But
pigs
it
were
does
not
eat
acceptable.
anything,
And I can tell you, this, you may not want to hear this, but my dad was foreman at a feedlot where I was growing up. And when one of the cattle would die,
Yeah.
he would load it on the back of his pickup, and I would drive out to a farm that had a bunch of hogs, and I'd take a chain and I'd pull that dead cow off, and I'd take a knife and slit his stomach so the hogs would have something to eat.
That's what I
Okay.
wanted to hear.
And many farmers feed hogs tankage. Well, what is tankage?
They will eat anything.
It's nothing but dead animals.
So I figured that
Prepared
might be
properly.
what was
So-
the reason.
But the point is that God said it, and this is so important truth for us to accept, that God said it. He didn't explain why. He just said this is the way it's going to be. We do not have to be able to explain the reason why something is sinful or not. It is sin because God says it is sin. It is clean because God says it is clean. And it is holy because God says so. That is all that you and I need. And I've told you before, there's a book in my library that at the end of every chapter said, God said it. He goes on to say, I believe it, and that settles it. I don't agree with that second part, though. God said it, and that settles it, period. And that's the point that God is trying to make to the Israelites here. Well, why do we need to do this, Lord? Because I said so. And that's the way it is. It's kind of like parents saying to their children, Mommy, can I have this candy bar? No, you can't. Why not? Because I said so.
There was a reason behind it.
There's a reason behind what God said here,
That's
too.
exactly my point. There was a reason the pigs could
So,
eat.
We are not gods who must be able to explain why the laws are the way that they are. Okay? God gives one explanation, and this is all that matters. I want you to go to Luke. I don't know if I have it up here. Let me just see if I do. Okay. Maybe. Yeah, here we go. Well, I want you to. Okay, I don't have the verse. Look at verse 44 and 45 of Leviticus chapter 11.
44 and 45?
Yeah, we're going to let Chuck read first, okay?
All right.
You want to read that, Chuck?
For I am the Lord who brings you up out of the land of Egypt to be your God. You shall therefore be holy, for I am holy. This is the law of the animals and the birds and every living creature that moves in the waters, and of every creature that creeps on the earth.
In verse 45.
Okay. That's where I
That was
started.
45, he started at 45.
47 says to distinguish between the unclean and the clean, and between the animal that may be eaten and the animal that may not be eaten.
Okay? And so the point is, God gives one explanation of this, and that is all that matters. I'm God, and I said so. The message is very simple. God is holy. Okay? Therefore, you and I must be holy. This is why God gave Leviticus chapter 11 through chapter 15. God must tell us what makes one holy and what makes one unholy. It's the same thing as driving down the street here. If we didn't have the traffic lights and we didn't have the stop signs, we wouldn't know whether to stop or to go. We'd just do it, wouldn't we? God is very specific in His instructions to us. And so these laws are a life preserver to the people so that they will do what they can to remain clean before the Lord. The cleanliness laws serve two purposes then. One, to help keep the people from spreading disease. And we'll look at some of those diseases. And two, to make a distinction between the sons of Israel and the other nations. Remember, when they go into the promised land, there's going to be all these other nations around them and everything. And they're going to be evil nations. So they need to understand the difference between clean and unclean. So, matters which were regulated then. First off, we had the clean and unclean animals. The law of God specified certain animals as being clean and unclean. And this is in chapter 11, verses 1 through 23. Now, we'll not read all the verses. Well, we might go ahead and read them, but we'll break it up. Isaac, read verse 1 through 7. That'll complete a sentence there. And then, Ron, if you'll read verse 8, and go ahead and read down through verse I'm going to give you a little longer one, Ron. Read 8 through 20. Okay? So, Isaac, read 1 through 7 for me.
Now the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying to them, Speak to the children of Israel, saying, These are the animals which you may eat among all the animals that are on the earth. Among the animals, whatever divides a hoof, having cloven hooves and chewing the cud, that you may eat. Nevertheless, these you shall not eat among those who chew the cud, or those who have cloven hooves. The camel, because it chews the cud, but does not have cloven hooves, is unclean to you. The roke, herrick, because it chews the cud, but does not have cloven hooves, is unclean to you. The hare, because it chews the cud, but does not have cloven hooves, is unclean to you. And the swine, though it divides a hoof, having cloven hooves, yet does not chew the cud, is unclean to you.
Read verse 8 also.
Their flesh you shall not eat, and their carcasses you shall not touch.
All right,
They are
now,
unclean to you.
Now, before you read, Ron, let's answer question number 1 on page 28. And that deals with the clean and unclean animals on the land. And how could the people determine which animals were to be eaten?
Choose a good and
Good.
Okay? Why? Or explain it.
because the Lord said so.
The Lord said so that's it.
Okay? What was the rock hyrax that you read about in verse 5?
Never heard that.
Badgers.
Do what?
Badgers.
Badger? Is that what your commentary said?
That's where I looked it up. Yep, I said the badger.
That's what some of the other translations said.
Did it?
Yeah.
I didn't get that.
What did you get?
Well, it's a. I forget which country it's in. Palestine, I want to say. It abounds in Judea and Palestine, and also in Arabia. And it is not a rabbit, but it resembles the rabbit. Okay. And it does chew a cud like a rabbit, but like a rabbit, it does not have cloven feet. So that's what I got, but I won't dispute. I don't think a badger chews a cud, though. That's the only reason I wouldn't say it was a badger.
He's cute.
I'm thinking he has a picture of one.
Looks like a little furry dog.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't eat him. That's cute.
Now I want you to also think about, you go to Acts chapter 10, if you will. I didn't put that up there, but I want you to go to Acts chapter 10, because there's an interesting story here. This deals with Peter. Okay? And at the, let's see,
13.
look at,
Verse 13.
Yeah, that's
Well,
where I was at.
well, yeah, we'll go there in a minute, but what I want you to see before we get there is I want you to see where was Peter staying? Whose house was he staying in?
Simon the Tanner.
Simon the tanner, that's verse 6. What do we know about a tanner?
They worked with
Catch a
dead
lot of
animals.
unclean animals.
Yeah, kind of animals might be considered unclean.
Yeah.
And yet the Jews were told to stay away from this, right?
Right.
Now that doesn't mean that Peter personally handled these unclean animals, but he was staying in a house of someone who did. Now what's that tell you a little bit about Peter? Because as Chuck mentioned here, you go down to verse 12, it says, in it were all kinds of 4-foot animals. This was the sheet that was brought down when Peter was sleeping. All kinds of animals of the earth, wild beasts, creeping things, and birds of the air. And a voice came to him, rise, Peter, kill and eat. But Peter said, not so, Lord, for I have never eaten anything common or unclean. He was following the law that was given back here in Leviticus, was he not?
Yeah.
Which was typical of Jews. And Peter was a devout Jew, although he was an apostle. What would that tell you about Peter at this point in his life?
He still hadn't been converted yet.
Yeah.
He had not been completely converted. I'll
Yeah.
use that phrase,
Yeah.
okay? He was still, while he was an apostle, he was still holding to Jewish tradition. You go a little bit further, because Peter then, after he went to Cornelius and his household, and and they received the Holy Spirit, and Peter then baptized them. What did he do then? Where did he have to go?
Jerusalem.
Why?
Talk to the other apostles.
He went back and he began to explain to the apostles exactly what took place here, didn't he?
Yeah.
And explained to them that how could I deny them to become a Christian when God showed me that he was no respecter of persons. But yet they still had some issues with Gentiles. Now, the Apostle Paul, when he was preaching a little bit later in the book of Acts, ran across a group of people who probably were Christians, but they were Jewish Christians, were trying to enforce circumcision upon the Gentiles, saying that you could not truly be a Christian unless you were circumcised. What did Paul do then?
He went to Jerusalem.
He went back to Jerusalem. Why do you think he went back to Jerusalem?
Because they wasn't accepting his word on it.
That's where it came
But
from.
he was an apostle. They saw him do miracles and everything. They knew exactly that he was a man of God, and he was able to perform miracles that nobody else could perform. So why couldn't they accept him as an apostle and accept what he taught here?
Because they wanted the word from the original apostles. They didn't consider him an original.
Well, that's a possibility.
Well, these Judaizing teachers, these Christians had come out of Jerusalem.
That's
So
my
he went-
point.
He went back to the source.
He went back to the source because the apostles and the elders, remember the scripture specifically says he went back to the apostles and he went to the elders to discuss this with them. And Peter stood up and reminded them of exactly what he went through with Cornelius and his household. And as Chuck mentioned here, this was the source. Remember when Saul was persecuting the Christians, they were scattered abroad whenever we're preaching the word. But they were still Jewish Christians, okay? And many of them may still be holding the same as Peter was, the old law, the requirement to be circumcised here. So Paul goes back to Jerusalem, the source, to get this thing resolved so that they're teaching accurately God's word and teaching accurately Jesus. This circumcision was no longer required. And that's, in my opinion, the whole reason he went back to Jerusalem. It wasn't that he had to go back to Jerusalem. If he had to go back to Jerusalem, I would think that we'd have the same issue when he went to the church at Corinth and he wrote the letters to them and all the problems the church at Corinth was having. He never once went back to Jerusalem to get an answer for those things. Chuck?
We see the same thing when he was baptizing Silas and Timothy. One, he denied the act of circumcision, and the other one, he performed the act of circumcision.
Right. Yep.
Well, he performed the one because he wanted, he was going to take Timothy with him and he's going to teach Jews. And they would maybe not have listened to him.
Yeah, see, well, Timothy wasn't actually a Jew. Silas was.
Right. Right.
His mother was.
But I mean, what Pat's saying, I don't certainly is part of the whole situation. And here's the point, that as we look at skin diseases in 13 and 14 of chapter of Leviticus, we're going to deal with this circumcision. Now, there's two reasons why circumcision was required. The first one being what?
Promise.
Promise.
What?
Binding of the covenant.
Binding of the covenant. It was a covenant between the Israelites and God, okay? But there was another reason why circumcision was required. This one you won't see in the scriptures. I'm just telling you this. Because if you read between the lines, you can
Is
see
it because, I
Cleanliness.
thought I remember reading something
The
about
cleanliness
this,
part of it?
that they come.
Something to do with cleanness?
Yeah, it has to do with cleanness.
Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead, Karen.
I was gonna go far as a part of the paganism that was around them. I know they circumcised unto false gods, and God had the children of Israel be circumcised unto him, which was the covenant of God, to show the people, the pagan people around them, that they were of God and that covenant relationship with God. The difference there. That's where I was going. But
And I won't disagree with that. That certainly can be part of it as well. The part I was going to suggest to you, and this is just from reading medical journals and stuff, okay? Uncircumcised males, when they marry, if they do not do a good job of keep themselves clean in the marital relationship, there's a higher instance of cancer, cervical cancer for the women. Okay? So it does have to do a little bit with cleanliness. And but the primary reason is the covenant relationship. Okay? And that's what the scriptures say. All right, so look then at Ron, read verse 9 through 20 for me.
These you may eat of all that are in the water. Whatever in the water has fins and scales, whether it in the seas or in the rivers, that you may eat. But all in the seas or in the rivers that you do not have fins and scales, all that move in the water, or any living thing which is in the water, they are an abomination to you. They shall be an abomination to you. You shall not eat their flesh, but you shall regard their carcasses as an abomination. Whatever in the water does not have fins or scales, that shall be an abomination to you. And these you shall regard as an abomination among the birds. They shall not be eaten, they are an abomination. The eagle, the vulture, the buzzard, the kite, the falcon after its kind, every raven after its kind, the ostrich, the short-eared owl, the seagull, the hawk after its kind, the little owl, the fisher owl, and the screech owl, the white owl, the jackdaw, and the carrion vulture, the stork, the heron after its kind, the hoopoe, and the bat, all flying insects that creep on all fours shall be an abomination to you.
All right.
Sure don't leave nothing out.
In your handout, question number 1 on chapter 11, verses 9 through 12. Clean and unclean creatures in the water. Which animals are permitted?
Fins and scales.
Okay. Which are forbidden?
They don't have fins and scales.
I would say everything else, probably.
How many of you love catfish?
Oh.
I do.
They don't have fins and
Some
scales.
catfish. don't like them strong. I
Only
like-
fried.
If they're
But
prepared
they,
right.
but they are a garbage fish, so they'll eat anything they can get their
Exactly
mouth
right.
on.
So,
Catfish are gross.
let's just ask a question here. Of all of these fish, the ones that had the scale were, in those days, the most nourishing. Okay, they were clean. They were the most nourishing. And God wants them to understand cleanliness and nourishment. The others, which are without scales, or whose bodies are covered with a thick, glutinous matter, because they weren't able to process it the way we process things today, in general, were difficult to digest. And so God gives specific instructions to stay away from things that are unclean, things that are not healthy for you. Okay? Any thoughts?
You knew they
Yes,
couldn't
Jeff.
catch a whale.
Have you ever read that book called None of These Diseases?
Yes, I had that in my library.
That's a good book to get some of this information.
Yeah. Pat, you have a comment?
No.
All right. So then, the question that deals with verses 13 through 19, clean and unclean flying creatures, which animals are permitted?
Grasshopper are permitted,
Yeah, which animals are permitted?
those
Permitted.
with legs that bend.
Well, yeah, the grasshoppers that you're dealing with, Pat, was in verses 20 through 23, which we haven't,
On there, yeah.
we read verse 20, but not 21 through 23.
But that creep on all four shall be an abomination.
The clean and unclean flying creatures.
Chicken, duck, guinea, and goose.
Do what?
Chicken and a duck and a guinea and a goose.
Yeah, chicken, duck, and a guinea and a goose.
The non-meat eaters.
And you better not eat an eagle now or you'll still be in trouble.
That's true. They are protected.
The
But
non-meat eaters.
John is right. The fowls forbidden in the diet are all either ravenous or cruel, okay? Or such as delight in the night and darkness, like the owl, but they're also ravenous, okay? Or such as feed upon impure things. Dead roadkill would be a good example. And so the signification here and reason of these prohibitions is manifest to teach men to abominate all cruelty or oppression and all works of darkness and filthiness. Okay, and that's going to be elaborated on a little bit more, but that was the idea behind these. All right, look at verses 21 through 23, Stephanie.
Yet these you may eat of every flying insect that creeps on all fours, those which have jointed legs above their feet, with which to leap on the earth. These you may eat: the locust after its kind, the destroying locust after its kind, the cricket after its kind, and the grasshopper after its kind. But all other flying insects which have 4 feet shall be an abomination to you.
All right, now then, that brings us to page 29 of your handout.
Yeah.
The first question: clean and unclean creeping creatures, which animals are permitted?
Locust and grasshopper.
Locust, cricket, and grasshopper.
Poppers, yep.
Okay.
And I don't want to eat
After each kind, destroying.
How about flies?
Nope.
Wasp?
Nope.
Bees?
Mhm.
They creep up on the earth.
They don't have the right kind of legs and feet.
it.
They got 6, don't they?
They have 6 legs.
It says 4.
Yep. It is, and if it be said that these have 6 legs, it is answered that their 2 4 feet are not properly feet, but rather serve them for hands. Locusts, though unusual in our food, were commonly eaten by Ethiopians and Libyans and Parthians and other Eastern people bordering upon the Jews. And if you went to Matthew, the 3rd chapter, verse 4, that was our third bell, but what did John the Baptist eat?
Locusts and wild honey. I was just gonna say that John the Baptist ate locusts.
All right, we'll continue chapter 11 next week and get into chapter 12.
Page 28 or 29.
Yeah.
Page 29. Would be the second